After the violent confrontation at the U.S. Capitol last week, many people, while shocked, were not exactly surprised. The highly charged politics south of the border, under a president who has not demurred from telling outright falsehoods to fire up his base, were hiding in plain sight. Might there be undercurrents of political extremism that we should be paying attention to before something similar could emerge in Canada? And do progressives try to inappropriately tar Canadian conservatives with the same Trumpist brush? With us to consider all of that, and as is our custom, we'll introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in the nation's capital with John Ibbitson. He's the writer-at-large for the Globe and Mail. In Perth, Ontario, Randy Hillier, the independent MPP for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston. In Oshawa, Ontario, Barbara Perry, professor and director at the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism at Ontario Tech University. And in East York of the provincial capital, Supriya Dwivedi, political commentator and former talk radio host. And it's good to have all of you alongside with us tonight in our virtual get-together here on TVO. John, to you first, to what extent do you think that the anger we saw in Washington last week exists here in Canada?
Well, it is a truism that everything that happens in the United States eventually happens in Canada, and to a lesser degree. So it is probably true that the kinds of resentments, the really unfortunate and regrettable nativist resentments, the resentments of the rural towards the urban, the cultural resentments that fired Trumpism are here in Canada as well. It's probably also true that thanks to social media, the transfer across the border of the tensions between progressives and conservatives, the rendering of that debate from "I disagree with you" to "you are illegitimate in my eyes," is going to happen here faster than it might have happened in the past. My deep, profound hope, of course, is that this is a much more stable society, a much more consensual society, a society that still retains fundamental levels of trust in its institutions, and that whatever stress we receive, we will be able to endure and overcome. But we're going to have some of it. There's no question about that. You see it already on the social media feeds if you spend, as I do, far too much time on Twitter.
Well, this is not an academic discussion for one of our guests today because Supriya Dwivedi left her talk radio position not too long ago because some of the stuff that she was seeing, she felt she wasn't getting very much backup from the managers of the place where she worked. Supriya, I wonder if you could fill us in on, to the extent that you can talk about this, fill us in with some of the details, if you would.
Well, I think it really started to manifest itself in the aftermath of the Quebec City mosque shooting, where we all sort of got into this national debate over whether or not the House should pass a non-binding parliamentary motion condemning Islamophobia. And there was a large amount of misinformation and disinformation that was being put on the airwaves, not just on, the talk radio station that I was on, but really across the country in terms of tabloid print and talk radio in particular. And I would notice, for example, whenever my show did a fact-based piece on the Islamophobia motion, and some of the other shows, were trafficking in some of that mis and disinformation that I was referring to, I would see a direct correlation in terms of the kinds of things that would end up in my inbox and just the sheer volume of it. And for me, it became sort of this constant cycle that whenever there was something in the news cycle that had to do with immigration, that had to do with visible minorities, that had to do, with race more generally, I would start to see an uptick in hate. And I don't think there was, my contention is I don't think there was enough necessarily done to try and curb some of the mis and disinformation that was being put on the airwaves.
Now, you had a white male co-host, yes?
I did. I had two co-hosts that were both white and male.
Did they get the same kind of stuff?
I mean, they definitely got it, but I don't think they got the same in terms of volume and in terms of content. Matt Gurney, my first co-host, described it as it would be like, "Oh man, you suck," whereas I would get something like, "You suck, you bleep stained C word, and I'm going to rape you." So very different in terms of the content.
You got that?
Oh, regularly, yeah.
Okay, Barbara, let me bring you into this conversation here. While the events that were taking place at the doors of the U.S. Capitol were happening, we had our own little Made in Ontario event take place in the streets of Toronto as well. There was a caravan of, there were a bunch of pickup trucks driving around downtown Toronto with lots of pro-Trump flags and pro-Trump slogans. And I wonder what you thought about that when you heard about it.
Well, I guess I wasn't surprised, and I should say it wasn't only Toronto either. There were similar protests, not the caravan so much as gatherings of individuals in half a dozen cities across the country. And we know that there has been support for Trump since he first ran in 2015. In fact, his campaign, and so they were Canadians for Trump that emerged immediately after he began to run, and they're still active, and that's certainly what we've seen. And there is, sort of sympathy for Trump and his plight, as they describe it, but also for some of the other ideologies that support the patriots as they frame themselves in Washington last week. So we do see sort of an anti-authority movement in Canada as well. So no surprise it would manifest in the context of those protests, the American protests.
Now, just to be clear, the Constitution of this country permits peaceable assembly. To the best of my recollection, nobody destroyed any property, nobody hurt anybody else. Is there anything illegitimate about these protests?
Certainly nothing illegal about them. And they were expressing grievances, and they were expressing sympathy for Trump. Where we see the problems, and this happens more online than offline, although we see it on the streets as well, is celebration of that violence and promotion of that violence. And we're seeing some of that on the online chatter of some of the Canadian far-right groups in particular, not so much the anti-staters, that is echoing those calls that we're hearing from the U.S. for violence at Washington Capitol and state capitals as well in the week to come.
Now, Randy Hillier, I've left you to the end purposely just so that you could have a chance to hear what everybody else has to say first, and you're the lone elected person in our grouping here this evening as well. And I want to make it clear at the outset, we did not invite you on this program because we expect you, quote unquote, to carry the can for all of what happened in the United States. But I am interested in, as an independent MPP, which is what you are, I'm interested in how much of Donald Trump's politics you feel some kind of kinship with. Let's start there.
Well, he's not the great evil Satan. Let's start with that. He's an individual that has his views and has expressed them in a way that is that some people dislike, but a great many people obviously do like. And but I think the important thing here, Steve and everyone, is that in a Western-style liberal democracy, debate and discussion is essential for it to function. Even when that debate and discussion goes into uncomfortable grounds. And we're seeing a very pervasive censorship and suppression of views that are not part of the conformist agenda. Like this is, if you hold dissenting views, however moderate, however science-based and factual, they are still deemed to be vile and offensive and worthy of suppression and censorship. And we've seen this. Stephen LeDrew and I have done a number of videos, and they have been censored. If you don't give people the avenue to express themselves, to ventilate their concerns, then what are people left with but to elevate their disenchantment? And I think we need to take a step back and say, if we want to have a healthy society, we cannot just have one orthodoxy and subscribe evil, satanic elements to somebody that has a differing view.
I take your point, and I just want to find out where that line is that we can draw between what is maybe uncomfortable or even outrageous free speech versus libelous, slanderous, harmful, awful stuff. Do I take it that you don't approve of the kinds of emails that Supriya Dwivedi would have received calling her all those foul names?
Oh, absolutely. Like this is, we're seeing this growth in this outrageous behavior, and it's unacceptable and it's offensive. And I would say this is the outgrowth of the increasing nihilism that we have in our society, where nihilism and this destruction of our political, our social, our economic, our religious orders. We've seen this, and it's been really amplified during COVID as well. This where reason and rational thought is impotent, and offensive, outrageous behavior is the last refuge of these scoundrels of nihilism, and social media is a haven for this.
Let me follow up with John Ibbitson on this, because, John, I wonder how important you think it is to distinguish between, say, as Mitt Romney might have called it, severe right-wing conservatism, a distinction between that and the absolute, violent QAnon, bat-spit, crazy Trumpist nut jobs, many of whom we saw in Washington last week.
Well, it's a pretty clear dividing line, and it exists on both sides of the border. If you say something that incites violence, then you're not allowed to say it. The President of the United States was impeached yesterday in the House of Representatives for the second time because he uttered speech last Wednesday, a week ago, that incited the mob to storm the Capitol and to almost bring down the congressional arm of the government. That was horrifying, and he has been punished severely for it. You can say anything you want, but you can't say it in a way that puts other people at risk. The same, for that example, applies with the issue of masks. We can debate whether masks are appropriate or inappropriate up until the point that the medical science says you must wear masks or you put other people at risk. When you say, I refuse to wear a mask because I don't care whether other people are at risk and I have my rights, you are putting other people at risk. And at that point, we start to limit your right to put those arguments forward. Or at the very least, we force you to wear the mask. Say what you will, we force you to wear the mask. And there is then one other important point to this. You can say whatever you like, but it is not incumbent on others to give you a platform to say it. We don't care what your opinions are, but the Globe and Mail does not have an obligation to let you express them in the Globe and Mail any more than Twitter or Facebook do. These are private companies, not public institutions, and we need to make that distinction as well.
Well, let me follow up with Supriya on that, and I'd be interested in your view on the Supriya, in as much as, Stephen LeDrew is a guy who was once president of the Federal Liberal Party of this country. He had a TV show on CP24 for many years. He's now trying his hand at digital content, doing these 3-minute interviews with a variety of people on a variety of subjects, and then he uploads them to YouTube. He did do one episode, at least one episode, I think, with Randy Hillier, and apparently YouTube wouldn't put it up. Randy Hillier's legitimately elected by the people of his constituency, and he would argue his free speech was impinged upon there. Do you think that's okay?
I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, YouTube, as John pointed out, is fully within its rights to decide what kind of content they would have put on their platform. And if Mr. LeDrew or Mr. Hillier have an objection to that or take issue with it, nothing is stopping them from creating their own website and just uploading the video to there or putting it on their own social channels. There's a big difference between having the state be the one that is infringing upon what you are saying and what private business is allowed to consider what is appropriate or not for their own medium and for their own audiences. And I think that is a distinction that is often lost and that often gets muddled as we have these, more esoteric conversations about free speech, because we tend to think of it as free speech, meaning you're allowed to say whatever the heck you want on whatever medium or platform that you wish. And that's just certainly not the case. And in a lot of ways, it's even more regressive and more chilling if you're compelling and forcing private business to do something that is something that they don't want to do, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing that you would see in autocratic countries. It's not the kind of thing that you want to see in, as Mr. Hillier described, Western democratic societies.
Well, let me get to Randy Hillier on that. I mean, the charter, Randy, is supposed to protect you against incursion on your rights by governments. YouTube is a private company. They're under no legal obligation to put up material they find unacceptable to them. Were your rights really infringed upon by this company as a result?
Well, let's look at the actual facts. It wasn't just a case of a video taken down. They've actually removed my YouTube channel for 3 months for rebroadcasting Dr. Roger Hodkinson's address to Edmonton City Council during the debate on whether a mask bylaw was proper and informed. But let's also look at what others are happening. Barry Weiss from the New York Times said this very well last year when with the resignation letter over how free speech is being impinged upon, not just in social media, but throughout all media. And yesterday, I believe, or yesterday or the day before, Daniel Smith, another talk radio host, and also a former leader of a prominent political party in Alberta, announced her leaving talk radio because speech is being infringed upon to the degree where dissent, any dissent, is objectionable. It's just, we're creating this expectation of conformity to only one orthodoxy, and everybody around this panel are knowledgeable and well read, and everybody in your audience will understand this. If you silence moderate scientific facts and suffocate discussion within our society, that brings with it some very dark elements. And everybody on this panel, many are involved in journalism in the media. The media, I would say, has an obligation to defend freedom of speech in every medium, in every avenue. Of course, and this has been long held and long understood. We know what constitutes defamation and libel and slander. And the media in the past, over the decades, has done a very good job of constraining that offensive or defamatory language. But now I hear crickets from the media when all other dissenting views, I've seen it happen to myself, we've seen it happen to many people, dissenting views of any sort are not given an avenue anywhere and it's not just social media, it's a great many of our media outlets.
Well, I suspect we're going to have some dissenting views on this next piece of information that I bring forward. And Sheldon, to that end, I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osman, bottom of page 2, if you could bring up this chart. Thanks. Angus Reid did a poll last November of people who voted in the last federal election in Canada, but they were asked about whether or not they thought the American election, the just held presidential election in the States, was fair and therefore should not be contested. And, okay, you see, I'm going to go into some detail on this for people who can't see the chart because they're listening on podcast right now. In total, 75% of those surveyed said, yes, the U.S. election was fair and should not be contested. Only 18% of Canadians disagreed with that notion. But let's break it down a little further, and we'll go to the next set of graphs, the next set of bars. Only half of those who voted Conservative thought the U.S. election was fair. 41% thought it was not fair, 41%. However, if you look at the more progressive end of the political spectrum in this country, 95% of those who voted Liberal, 92% of those who voted New Democrat, 81% of those who voted for the Bloc Québécois in Quebec strongly or agreed that the U.S. election was fair. That is a significant difference. Barbara Perry, what do you infer from those numbers?
Well, I think it's follows some of the patterns in the U.S. as well. We see that same split between Democrats and Republicans as we see here, and I think that it is, a vulnerability to believe the narratives that Trump and his followers have been professing. In the absence of any evidence, I remember seeing one of the protesters last week who was questioned by a journalist, "What are you trying to do here?" And he said, "Well, we're trying to stop the steal. There's all kinds of evidence that that election was stolen, and yet we have yet to see any of that evidence." And so I think this is the danger. It's not just uncomfortable speech that we're talking about. It's not just dissent. It is false disinformation and misinformation and dangerous speech that we're worried about. And we saw what the dangers of that kind of ongoing narrative were last week, and we'll see more of that in the coming week.
John, I wonder how troubled you are by the notion that half the people who voted, only half the people who voted for the Conservative Party in the last federal election thought that the American election was fair and ought not to be contested.
Well, I'm disturbed, of course. It is upsetting that extremist, right-wing, illegitimate lies should have convinced a minority, let us stress, but still a minority of conservative voters that Donald Trump's lies are somehow true. But it is the nature of the times in which we live. If you sent out a poll that asked people what they thought about the statement, "Canada is an illegitimate criminal state founded in violence," you would find that a surprisingly large number of people on the left wing of the spectrum would accept this, to my mind, completely unfair and untrue characterization of what is, in my mind, the best country in the world. There are extremist elements on both sides, and others who are not so extreme get convinced by their rhetoric at various times on various issues. For example, over whether John A. Macdonald was the founder of this nation or a criminal. What bothers me is that in the debate, there are too often those who yell the loudest and those whose positions are least legitimate are the ones who are dominating the discussion, causing the kinds of polls that you see on both the left and the right, but making it harder every year, it seems, for moderate conservatives, moderate progressives to hold the center.
Supriya, how concerned are you that these numbers they certainly give the very strong impression that conservatives feel the fix is in against them?
Yeah, that's obviously a huge issue. And I think it's only exacerbated by the fact that we are in the middle of a pandemic, and you need folks to have trust in their institutions. You need people to have trust in the public institutions around them so that they don't become disaffected and you don't see the kind of violence that we currently witnessed last week in the US or in many other parts of the world. I think, though, the more troubling aspect here is that we are basically at a point where we can't even seem to establish what is and what is not true. The election was not stolen from Donald Trump. That is, by every sense of in terms of the evidence that's available and the facts that are on the ground, he lost legitimately that election. That you have a sizable minority of folks here in Canada that refuse to believe that, I think speaks to some of the more troubling aspects of the Conservative Party and their base and the media ecosystem that tends to prop up those voices. And just to give one example, I mean, during the Yellow Vest movement, when you had a minority, but a sizable minority of folks that were showing up to these protests with hang Trudeau signs or Trudeau for treason signs, you didn't necessarily hear or see right-leaning politicians vociferously condemn it. The reaction from a lot of the right was to just pretend it wasn't happening and to pass off any criticism or any pointing out of some of the more insidious elements as just deflecting from the issue. We need to expose the sorts of things that we're seeing, and we need to recognize this. And I think a part of the issue that is being compounded here is that a lot of the folks that do the reporting on political issues, whether it's on the commentary side or on the straight up reporting side, have a very poor understanding of online spaces and online radicalization. And I think another really good example of that was in the immediate aftermath of the Toronto van attack, where you had a bunch of journalists that were rather established come out and profess they're not knowing about the existence of incels whatsoever, let alone that they could have a propensity towards violence. If you ask some of the younger journalists, some of the female journalists about incels, I mean, they would tell you quite readily that they knew about their existence and they knew about the online radicalization aspect of incels since Gamergate back in 2014. And I think our political establishment and our media establishment does a very poor job of translating that information to the public.
Okay. Randy, I do need to get your interpretation of those numbers, and I'll set up the question with this. Donald Trump and his lawyers went to court more than 60 times, barely ever introducing actual empirically provable evidence that the election was stolen, got thrown out of court. I think they won once and lost 60 times. And some of the appearances they made in court were just downright embarrassing. I mean, Rudy Giuliani made a fool of himself over and over and over and over again. This was sworn by so many election observers, including Republicans, to be a basically clean election, the results of which we should respect, and yet half the Conservative Party voters in this country, only half, thought it was a free and fair election. What are we to infer from that?
Well, I think one of the things, Professor Jonathan Haidt explored this divide very well in his book, The Righteous Mind, and looking at the differences between the psychological characteristics of conservatives and liberals, but also looking at the elements of why we're getting to where we are in society. And that doesn't surprise anybody, because these days in the Western world, in Canada, the United States, and others, we intuitively and default dismiss any suggestion from the other side, no matter how valid, no matter how extreme, no matter however moderate. We intuitively and default just reject it, and we use language that is a language of rejection as well. Like, I heard the term misinformation used in this discussion, and because somebody has a different opinion, that doesn't mean it's misinformation.
Does the opinion not have to be based in fact, though, Randy?
Well, we have facts, and we have evidence, and we have data, and we can draw different conclusions from that. And we can draw different opinions from that. That does not mean it's misinformation. And we should be embracing those various opinions and different perspectives that come into the marketplace of discussion. And indeed, our parliament, the root word parliament is derived from the French word parler, to speak. And to speak, it also requires someone to listen. And in parliament, it engraved in the walls, it says to hear the other side. Okay, and I put this far more down to this terrible growth in nihilism in our countries, where people are losing meaning and purpose in their lives, and going into this very extreme conformist mindset where you can only be individual if you conform. And if you don't conform, that gives us license to be offensive and vile to you. And whatever that conformity is, whether it's on the right or the left, this is a terrible situation that we're setting our government, our society, our peaceful, good-ordered society into a very extreme outcomes and dangerous outcomes. And we need to go back to our principles of freedom of speech, of freedom of assembly, and to listen to the other side if we're to come out of this with anything that resembles a good and prosperous and successful society.
Okay, let me try this with Barbara. Barbara, I'm going to read something that Jonathan Kay wrote in the National Post a week ago. Sorry, John, rival newspaper, but humor me for a second here. And then, Barbara, I'd like you to comment on it. Jonathan wrote, "It's now been more than 5.5 years since Trump announced his presidential campaign. His politics are toxic, but they are no longer ascendant or even novel. And Wednesday's fiasco will only discredit them further. If right-wing populism really were going to metastasize northward in a meaningful way, it would have happened by now, but it hasn't." Jonathan Kay seems quite comforted by that. Barbara, I wonder whether you think he should be.
Well, I don't think it is the case that it hasn't migrated northward. I think we have seen a dramatic increase in far-right populism and far-right activity in the Canadian context. We estimate in 2015, our first report on right-wing extremism, we estimated just over 100 active far-right groups in Canada, and now we're looking at closer to 300 active groups, and many more individuals that don't necessarily affiliate with particular groups, but engage very much with their social media platforms. So those sentiments are here. We've seen evidence of that in terms of the violence we've seen in the past few years. Manassian being one, Bissonnette being another, Justine Bourque. I could go on. I mean, we've had over 20 homicides associated with far right narratives in the past 6 or 8 years or so. And then you add that, I think, again, to the online activity, to the fact that, Rideau Cottage, the grounds of Rideau Cottage were invaded by a military personnel with 4 guns, including 2 assault rifles. It has come here, and we need to confront it. We don't need to dismiss it. I don't want to dismiss it. I want to confront it. I want to challenge it. I want to have those conversations and deconstruct some of the ideologies that enable that kind of violence.
Having said that, John, you had a piece in the Globe and Mail the other day in which you basically warned everybody, here it comes. The Liberals are going to be painting all conservatives with the same Trumpist brush. Get ready for it, particularly as we get closer to an election. What's your concern there?
Again, the inability to have civil dialogue. It is, we need to worry far more about extremist right-wing violence. In fact, we don't need to worry about extremist left-wing violence because it virtually doesn't exist. The violence comes from the right. It needs to be documented. It needs to be condemned. It needs to be, as far as the police can, prevented. So let's not try to make this a whataboutism. It's not. That this is an issue of the right, not of the left, in terms of violence. But if you characterize anyone on the right as illegitimate, if you characterize all conservatives as illegitimate, as being part and parcel, so maybe not as bad as the really right-wing nut jobs, but they're in the same camp. Every one of them, they're all in the same camp, as some progressives are doing. The Liberals are doing it because, hey, that's politics, right? But also other progressive groups are doing it as well. I wrote a column that said Mike Harris deserved the Order of Ontario. I was pilloried for it. I have written columns and books saying that there were positive elements to Stephen Harper's 10 years as Prime Minister. And in fact, it was more positive than negative. And you get on the other side of the argument, no, you cannot give Mike Harris the Order of Ontario. You cannot defend Stephen Harper as anything other than a dictatorial, autocratic, malevolent leader because conservatism is illegitimate. Conservatism does not deserve to have influence or power in this country. You only stoke and feed the fires of the trolls and the intolerance on all sides of the argument when you act like that. Yes, condemn violence in every aspect, on every form, but do not stifle debate and do not believe that one of the 2 governing parties of this country and the millions of people who support them are in bed with the extremists. It just makes it impossible, or at least far more difficult, for the rest of us to hold the thing together.
I warned you all when we started this thing that the time would fly by, and it really has. That's our time. I'm really grateful to all 4 of you for coming on to TVO tonight and having this conversation, which I think was a full, free, and openly aired debate, which we're very glad about. John Ibbitson, Randy Hillier, Barbara Perry, Supriya Dwivedi, be well, everybody, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.